Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Centre, sponsored by Small Church Connections. And this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. And today, our special guest is all the way from the metropolis of Calgary. I was going to say Saskatchewan, but we'll leave it in Alberta in Canada. And I'm just going to let her introduce herself, tell you a little bit about who she is, her own journey. And then we're going to get right into a topic today that I'm going to find very interesting, which is clergy resilience. So here is over to you, Margaret.
Thanks, Ron.
You're welcome.
So I'm Margaret Clarke, and I've just a week or two ago completed my doctoral dissertation from the University of Saskatchewan. And there I had the chance to study clergy resilience in my Ph.D. program. This is a topic I'm passionate about personally, as my husband has been in vocational ministry for 25 years, and we've partnered in that together. Professionally, I'm also a therapist, and I work with clergy and their families around this topic and helping them to thrive and to do well. And then I'm also a professor at Briarcrest Seminary, where I train new therapists, and so and also we train clergy at Briarcrest, and so it's an area that's near and dear to my heart. And I was really privileged to be able to study it in my doctoral degree. So I'm excited to be able to share some of the findings.
And your degree comes out of University of Saskatchewan, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did a degree at the University of Saskatchewan in educational administration. So again, as an educator, it fit. And because of this area, worked with Dr. Keith Walker, who is both somebody with vast experience, but also cares a lot about the church and is involved in some various research related to the church, specifically with Flourishing Congregations Institute, which has been studying flourishing with congregations. And this was a really nice partnership. So they actually partnered with me in doing some of my data collection around the survey that was rolled out last summer and helping to do some analysis of that.
So your survey itself, was that in the midst of COVID then?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things, so I that was not planned, of course. I was moving ahead with my dissertation, and then so the survey, I did a mixed method study, so that meant I did a national survey, and then I also did a one-on-one interviews with clergy, and then I also had what's called an interpretation panel, which is a number of people who have some expertise in denominational leadership, are educators of clergy, or people who provide care to clergy who spoke into my findings. So that all happened. The survey and the interviews happened between June and August of 2020. So it was really at the beginning of the pandemic. I didn't ask specific questions about COVID, but of course it came out. And in some ways, it was an interesting little experiment around resilience. And so, of course, the findings are affected by that, but I think they provide some good just awareness. They seem to resonate with people in general, and then in the midst of COVID as well. So
yeah, this guy, okay, from your research, I would love to find out what were some of the great stressors that you found pastors were, well, I used to say it's partly in COVID, but just being a pastor, I think has certain stressors too.
Yeah, and I was looking to get a really broad understanding. So my focus was on resilience, and resilience is really about the ability to bounce back from adversity. It's really that opportunity to kind of experience adversity or stress and then bounce back from it. So I did ask about adversity or stress that clergy experience. And so I can't say what was the greatest, that wasn't the type of research I did, but I got a really broad understanding from different people. So these may be a lot or a little for people, but there was 4 main themes. The first was workload. And this had to do just with the needs that were presented to clergy for them, the time it took, the complexity. And this one maybe was a bit higher in the midst of COVID because, and this is everything from needing to manage budgets, to take care of HR, to maybe fix a leaky window, to doing premarital counseling, to doing a death, and then on top of it with COVID, suddenly become a social media and streaming expert. And so complexity was one. It was also a piece that people appreciated about their roles, but it certainly was a stress or an adversity. The impact of change within the church was another aspect of that was identified as a stress. And then, of course, relational dynamics that occur in the church, both within the clergy or just within the congregation. So
Mhm.
that was one of the themes, was workload. Second was expectations. And these fell into some themes around societal expectations or even like negative views within society, financial pressures, both personal and congregational, denominational expectations that some clergy found a bit, stressful, congregational expectations, and the diversity of those and competing ones, self-expectations, the expectations that clergy had of themselves. And then also one of the categories was just barriers for women, the different expectations or barriers that women encountered, women clergy. So that was the second category of expectations. The third was isolation. And these again came down to a number of categories: geographic isolation for some clergy who serve in rural or remote locations, theological or cultural isolation. And this might be for clergy who are serving either in a community or congregation where they aren't aligned theologically or culturally. And it could be clergy coming from another country who don't fit necessarily as well with the congregation, or just that the community might be have a different. The isolation also was identified as coming from relocations that happen for clergy moves, and then just the different rhythms that clergy observe, that their work week does not look the same, their observation of maybe specific holidays are different, and so that can have an isolating effect for them. Then what we kind of called role separation, that for some they either felt like there was a bit of separateness between being able to connect with people because of the role, or people were hesitant to connect with them because they were clergy. Um, Decreased energy just because of the workload factor. They didn't have the energy to kind of engage. And then peer competition was another aspect of stress, where there was identified that there often is competition among clergy or congregations in that. So, and then the final category was just personal challenges that cause stress and challenges for clergy. And this is things like questioning one's calling, having spousal or family conflict, having health issues, and then just lack of self-awareness that can cause challenges. So they're again very broad, just getting an idea of what are the challenges that clergy experience. So those were lots of them.
Yeah, I've been trying to jot down a few and try and
Yeah,
keep them in my mind, and a
yeah.
few of them stick in my mind just because of some of the things I've talked with people that are involved with small churches,
Mhm.
and whether leaders of denominations or just separate churches. One of them
Mm,
is the whole area of calling. I would love to
mhm.
hear some of what you found in that whole area.
Yeah. So one of the things I did with my dissertation, based on my findings, I developed a theoretical model. I called it
Mhm.
the Clergy Resilience model. And so that'll be a part of what I'll be hoping to
Oh,
publish and share in
I'm sure it's a chart, isn't it? Or a nice
it's
big.
an
It's
image. I didn't, yeah, and really what it is. So for me,
yeah.
there's different kind of perspectives on resilience. Some people, some forms of research view it as just a personality trait, and then others look at it more as a process where it's a number of things interacting both within the individual, but also systemic factors that either help a person to be resilient or not. And so my model kind of looks at like what are sort of this balance between stress and adversity with the resources that support people. And so instead of it being static, it's really this dynamic tension that balances kind of back and forth. So when challenges increase, are there the resources that can kind of buffer against that? And so that's where, my hope is really to help clergy think about that balance in their
Mhm.
life and think about where they might be able to enhance some of their resources. But the interesting thing that I'm interested to do more work around was this concept that there were some overarching factors for clergy, and when one of them was, so I called it sort of the global meaning system,
Mhm.
and this was things like calling, the real sense of having a clear calling. The other one was this sense of partnership with God.
Ah,
Um,
mm,
and then the theological meaning making that clergy make, both of challenging situations and also the resources, that has a very profound impact on how they approach and view things. And so these can be resources. They can also be a negative at times. So for instance, when somebody's questioning their calling, that can have quite a profound impact on how how resilient they are in any given situation. The same thing with the theological meaning making, depending on their kind of orientation, how people make sense of what's going on, the challenges they face, or the opportunities to engage with resources that may enhance or deter them in that way. And so those are some of the things that a model to help clergy begin to think. It definitely wasn't just sort of, those things seem to have a higher level impact on this process of balance and how people balance that out. So something I'm looking forward to presenting and getting more input on how that resonates for clergy and how they find that helpful.
Yeah, I think that really resonates. I'm serving as an interim pastor right now, and I think calling has been one thing that has kept me going for, well, probably 35, 40 years of ministry. It's got to be there, and then thinking theologically about it. Yeah, very good. I'm going to give you a time at the end to do a promo about where we can find all this good material.
Okay.
And we'll make sure that is part of it.
Yeah.
Did you find that the stressors were greater in solo pastors or with multiple staff? Did multiple staff seem to have an easier go of it? Was there some kind of difference? Did you sense anything there?
So I couldn't give anything sort of concrete from a research perspective other than, so again, I did the survey. What we did is we collected some demographic information about the people who were responding. And then we had a number of wellness and other scales. So these are quantitative scales. Right. So for instance, we had some wellness scales and some satisfaction scales and what's called a grit scale, and some things like that. And one of the interesting things, so we were able to compare church size. So when participants, they indicated kind of what size of congregation there was no difference in any of the responses on the scales based on church size. So as far as like wellness or satisfaction, there were some questions, particularly around age, affected some of the wellness and satisfaction. Another one was, we asked a question about congregational flourishing. If the clergy felt their congregation was flourishing, they tended to have some higher scales around wellness and satisfaction and things like that, which was really interesting. We're interested to kind of dig into that further. But there wasn't anything specifically, so there wasn't what we call statistical difference. There wasn't anything significant based on size. So that said, that's the quantitative piece, right, which kind of provides one perspective. Again, I did mixed methods. So there was this qualitative piece. And so some of the responses I heard in my interviews, which I conducted myself, I think there's some unique nuances for people who serve, say, in a rural location compared to an urban location, or who are solo compared to multi-staff. And some of that would relate to some of those things like complexity. This sense of just, I have to do it all, and I think of one interviewee who, he was actually multivocational. So in addition to being a smaller church, it was multivocational, and just a sense of like, there's nobody else who, like, if the window gets broken, it's me. There is nobody else. There's not like a custodial or maintenance person on staff. It's just me. And that would be, something that would be different. The other piece that would be different, and we'll maybe talk in a bit about some of the resource categories that came out, is they may not have some of the built-in supports, peer support. So peer support was a big resource that was identified. And so that was interesting. Like a lot of multi-site churches might find that just in church, within their within their staff, but those who are solo would probably find that more meaningfully in other locations. Supervisor support was another one. A lot of small churches, obviously, it's, they don't have a direct supervisor. And so then do they connect somehow, or are they part of a denominational structure where they receive supervisory support in that capacity, whether it's a district superintendent or a regional pastor. So I think some of those things, I think it's good. And that's where I think for me, partly the therapist in me approaches this really from an individualized perspective of, I think each person needs to think about their context. What is the challenge and stress they're facing? And then what are the resources that they maybe already have, or what can they enhance And some of those might be things like what you guys do, where you provide some of that, the training and support they need. That was a big piece. Clergy just need training and support for the things that are going on. Like, how do you deal with this? That's something that was really part of their resilience. Opportunities to engage with peers who have similar situations,
Yeah.
and being able to talk with them. That was really part of supporting resilience. So those are a few things that come to mind.
Okay. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
our ministerial here in our smaller town, 6, 8 of
Mhm.
us, try to get together once a week. That has been
Mhm.
the best support and probably what has kept us resilient through COVID.
Totally.
And
Yeah.
so I really agree with you on that. I'm okay. So what makes a pastor resilient? Is that a question you can even answer, or?
I no, yes and no.
Okay.
So again, I would go back. So my approach is that and again, this is sort of, there's different streams about how we think about resilience. So I don't tend to see it like, oh, it's you're either of a resilient
Yeah.
personality or not. I think there are some personality characteristics that maybe help some people.
Okay.
And some that got identified in the study, where some people would say, well, I'm very optimistic, or I'm really flexible, and they would say that helps me. So there's some of those aspects, but I think it is really this piece of the dynamic balance, right?
Mm.
Of being tuned into what's going on, as far as the stress and the adversity. And then what are the resources that help to sort of mitigate or buffer against those? And so I think this piece of, what is resilience? I would say it's dynamic. It's not something like, you can't say I'm resilient and it's like a given. It's like, today
Yeah. Yeah.
I might feel
Tomorrow.
resilient. Yeah, because tomorrow, does a
Yeah.
pandemic hit? And so I think
Yeah.
that's where we saw the interesting thing with COVID is, we saw there were certainly a lot of challenges for clergy. Some people also found it as a really great time for them,
Mhm.
in that sense that they were able to reprioritize and engage deeply in some of the resources. But then also some people lost some of their supportive resources.
Yeah.
They couldn't do certain things that really helped them. Other things, like a lot of denominations upped their support during that time, and that was really appreciated.
Mhm.
They began having like weekly Zoom meetings that
Yeah.
they hadn't had before, and that was one thing I heard from a lot of participants, that they really valued that. So it was a great example of, any given day, things are ebbing and flowing, right? And especially in church ministry, suddenly there's some big crisis, or somebody dies, or there's a tragedy, or there's somebody very upset and there's a big conflict. And so I think that piece of considering, keeping in mind that, again, sort of the teeter totter or the weigh scale concept of what I use, of, those are always in balance. And ideally, my encouragement would be to make sure that you have enough resources in your life so that there's a bit of a margin there, that you're not so at the limit of, with your stress, with the challenges, that one little thing is going to put you over, and it's going to move from resilience to something that's not as healthy. So that's where I would encourage. And then those times when things change, what does it look like to increase that?
Mhm.
Increase the resources, and some of the things that, that are like things like peer support was a big one, spousal support was a huge one,
Yeah.
friends and family. But then other things like, the boundaries around work and life, and the balance between work and life. Just this piece of taking care of one's health was something that was referenced, as a part, again, learning, having the chance to do skill development and do lifelong learning was another one. But then also engaging in maybe professional supports. And this is where, things like professional counseling or
Mhm.
spiritual direction were also a big resource, that perhaps in times, maybe it's not all the time, but in times of increased stress, that clergy definitely identified as benefiting from.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. You've
mhm.
covered like about every question I had, except I've got 1,000 more now, but we'll continue on. If you okay, you've talked a lot about maintaining, and it's a dynamic
Mhm,
balance in order to maintain resilience.
mhm,
Now, I've got some young people that are looking at, and I'm working in a college myself, Eston College,
mhm,
where I see. I'm trying not to call them kids, but in some ways, that's sort of what they're just moving into that next level. And what would you tell someone like that is, if they're thinking, I'd love to pastor, or at least I'm thinking about pastoring a small church, what should they focus on in their own preparation? I mean, they haven't been in ministry yet, or in the in the hurly burly, or whatever the term may be of what goes on in ministry. What would you say they should focus on?
Yeah, so my study did look at some of the organizational factors that support. So again, resilience isn't just an individual process, it's also systemic, right? In our systems can either support clergy resilience or they can hinder, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so congregations, for instance, denominations. And so, there's a number of other findings that relate to those. As an individual, I think the piece to consider is, again, as we talked about, this aspect of clear calling was really, really important. Certain traditions. So again, I did all kinds of Christian traditions in Canada, mainline Catholic, and some of the other Protestant traditions. Some have very, very kind of rigorous processes for affirming calling. People have to be affirmed by their local congregation and then their diocese before they even go into training. For those clergy who did that process, it was actually very, very foundational to their resilience.
Yeah.
And that's because they would come back to that. When times got tough, that became like a foundation. And so I think even in, say, traditions that might not have that process, I think there's that piece of gathering around people who can affirm that, and helping being clear on that. And so I think that piece of affirm and clear calling is really important. With that, I would say, the hard part is sometimes the reality of ministry isn't quite as isn't quite as nice and neat as what we would hope it would be when we're kind of new or before ministry. And so I think there is this piece, and this is where mentoring, right? Having mentors was as another supportive resource, and having kind of that process of training, both in preparation and in early ministry. It really is about just that ability to kind of understand the challenges. There are a lot of really interesting challenges that ministries people face. And some of them are not very pretty or very fun. And I think there's some preparation of having a realistic view of those. That's really important. And so that would be another one. And then this piece of recognizing, I think one of the things that's interesting, I think some of the parts I kind of heard was, so there's this overarching kind of global meaning, which really relates to calling and theological perspective. That's so important. And I think in general, preparation wise, we do a pretty good job with that.
Yeah.
Some of the other pieces, the other resources, might feel a little bit more this kind of normal. And so I think sometimes because they're not like super spiritual, sometimes clergy might neglect them a little bit. And so I would just say, keep in mind that we are created to be whole beings. And so taking care of our physical well-being is a part of our resilience.
Go for a walk.
Go for a walk. Make sure you wouldn't. I heard a number of stories about clergy not having significant health problems related to not eating properly, both in underweight to the point of hospitalization because they weren't eating, because they were taking meetings and being busy, right? The demands of the role can make it easy to neglect those things. Also obesity, right, was a challenge. They weren't taking care of themselves and eating healthy. And so just things like that. Then the social dynamic of what it means to have relationships outside of the church, and support in those kind of ways where you have a life outside of the church. And then things like boundaries, right, where it's clear of the places that and things that aren't okay, and that it's okay to be able to say no. It's not okay for me to be treated this way, or balance, right? I can't work this many hours. Retreats and sabbaticals were also referenced as some of the things that support resilience. And so really that sense of what does it look like to take care of the whole being. So certainly the spiritual part was a huge part for clergy. I don't think there's any surprise that way. But I think sometimes what happens is the other parts, right? The psychological well-being, the social well-being, the physical well-being sometimes get neglected. And so I would just encourage that sort of well-rounded, and think about that. Think about, okay, how am I doing? How am I doing in this? If suddenly you lose a really significant resource, and this happened in COVID, like somebody who talked about swimming was huge for them, or just helped them to really do well. everything got shut down. And so it's like, okay, what do I do now? Right. And so having multiple resources that you're connected with, and then can, up in times when things, either you lose a resource, if a significant mentor passes away, or a peer who has been in your community moves away. Those are things that are going to impact your resilience, and thinking about how do I then, keeping that dynamic balance
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of my older friends, who has since passed away, had written in his Bible something about, you've got to have a lot of horse sense to be a pastor. Well,
Mhm.
just to be a Christian person, you should have stable relationships and learn to say nay. So,
Yeah.
oh yeah, just okay. We'll leave it at that. So, I unfortunately, we're about at the end here of our usual time, but the promo section needs to happen, because
Yeah.
I know I want to find some of this stuff that you've been doing, and so let us
Yeah.
know where we can find stuff, how we contact you, who. I mean, yeah, just
Yeah.
just go whatever you want to say, Margaret. It's up to you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm in the midst. So some of what I will be doing with this is still coming. So
Right.
again, I just defended at the end of June. So my dissertations shortly will be posted to a database where it will be accessible. It's long. The one thing just to know with dissertations is you usually read the first chapter and the last chapter, and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
unless you're really thrilled, you don't read the rest. That said, I will be working on doing some more user-friendly publications. So some of this will be like published research articles, because it's
Mhm.
really important that we have actual research out there to support some of the initiatives. And then will be more pragmatic tools. So I do hope to be writing some articles and doing podcasts like this just to share, and getting some of that out, and maybe more of a hands-on book and things like that. So that said, those things are still to come. That's sort of some of my fall and project of getting some of those good things going. I'm happy. So again, I'm at Briarcrest,
Mhm.
and I'm always happy if people want to be in touch there. My email
Okay.
is m.clarke, Clarke, at briarcrest.ca.
Okay.
And would be happy if there's some different things. I do probably the soonest thing that will be out is my actual dissertation, where it will be
Yeah.
available on a database
You know
and that
which
kind of thing.
database? I'm a
It's
librarian,
like
so I ask those questions.
wherever, I think it's the ProQuest dissertation
Oh,
database.
is it? Okay.
Does that make sense? It will be
Yep.
uploaded. I know. I'm sorry, we're just in process with it right now. So I
Yeah.
can always find that out if you want to share it at a further point.
Yeah,
So
I would be glad to share it. Plus, as I say,
yeah,
I'm also one of my other lives
yeah,
is being a librarian, so
yeah,
I would be glad to share
yeah.
some of that. Yeah.
Yeah, there are a couple books out there. One of the ones that I think is quite user friendly, and
Okay.
I can't remember if it's Resilient. It's by Searby, Searby. I'm going to check that
Okay.
really quick. And I think it's called Resilient Pastor. Um,
Okay.
and it really, I mean, it's slightly different than my research. Yeah, it's called The Resilient Pastor.
Mm-hmm.
10 principles for developing pastoral resilience.
Oh, okay.
It's a little bit different than my research, but very aligned.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's probably one of those tools that I would say, I know pastors like books.
Oh, yes.
That would be the one that it's really practical and hands-on. And again, so for instance, the calling piece, one of the principles he talks about is nurturing your calling.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think some of those principles in there are really helpful as well. So
Is there anyone that uh, you were able to contact, phone, text, email, that you said, oh, there's a person that really helped me in understanding resiliency? I'm saying that because there are a number of pastors who love books, and then there's a number of pastors
yeah,
who just love to talk. Just give me a phone number,
yeah,
whatever. Is there a person that
yeah.
you would say, oh, here's somebody that might just? Okay, this is a
Um,
question. Yeah, go ahead.
Resilience is a little bit, so again, there's some good, again, partly up in the academic world of research, right, which
Yeah.
isn't always as practical. there is some interesting research going on. And so like, again, that's a bit more of the academic world. One of the interesting things, if you're thinking more practically around clergy, just wellness, right?
Mhm.
Like resilience,
Yeah,
wellness, all that kind of stuff. Focus on the Family has some clergy care pieces that they do. And
yeah.
that's a bit more connected when folks are a bit in crisis. And so they have like a clergy referral network where they
Mhm.
actually have like therapists who specifically work with clergy. You can call there and do some telephone or online therapy, or they can refer to Christian therapists in the area who really, I think the thing I see, so I work with clergy specifically in my practice,
Yeah.
and I think they really need somebody they feel safe with and who understands ministry. And so that was one piece I would think of. The other one is Fairhaven Ministries in Vernon, BC.
Oh,
They're
Fairhaven, yes. Yeah.
yeah, so they are a clergy retreat, a leadership retreat center, but
Mhm.
they also really work with clergy around, again, wellness and resilience. And I think it's those some of those pieces, having some of they're the real practical kind of hands-on pieces around resilience,
Mhm.
and helping that. I think one of the things that's interesting is even like having some discussion with peers. Like, so if you're part of a peer group, or you're part of a mentoring kind of group, even just talking about like what are the things that help you to be resilient. I did interviews, and at the end, one of the things I was so touched by when I asked the folks, like I thanked them for participating, and I told them, I appreciated how meaningful it would be, but I asked them if what they found meaningful, and they said just the opportunity to talk
Yeah.
and reflect on how God has been at work in their calling and the aspects that do help them to be resilient. It just kind of empowered them and gave them hope. And so I think even just having those kind of conversations, too often clergy are kind of focused on other people.
Hmm.
And so that's where even just having some intentional conversations about that in your own life, whether it's with a spouse or with, some peers or a mentor, family members who are supportive, I think can just be really an important part to help you kind of be reminded about what's there and maybe think about some things like, oh yeah, maybe I could do to, connect a little bit more with peers right now. Like
Yeah.
I've lost some folks. So I think those things are helpful too.
This has been very, very informative and helpful. Thank you.
Yeah,
I have learned some things myself, which is great.
awesome.
So, anyways, this is the end. Maybe not the end. We'll probably talk again, and we'll continue to promote the work that you've been doing. Thank you very, very much,
Thank you.
Margaret. I appreciate it very
Yeah.
much.
Thank you, Ron. It's been great to be here.